get out or pay the rent. I was more affected by those remarks than by the truck that delivered me to this hospital bed. My stitches were still fresh when my father stood there, his face flushed with anger. The ache in my ribs was hardly relieved by the painkillers. He smacked me so hard when I refused that I fell to the ground, tasted blood in my mouth, and felt a crack in my chest. He snarled, "You think you're too good for this family." He didn't know what was going to happen, though. I'm 29-year-old Quanah Graves, and this is the tale of how I turned my own father's avarice into his biggest failure, and how he attempted to ruin me when I was at my lowest. Before I go any further, if you are listening to this, please hit the like button and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. I am so grateful for your support. The accident actually occurred 3 days prior. My automobile was T-boned on the driver's side by an intoxicated driver who ran a red light. The doctor told me I was fortunate to be alive. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, 27 stitches in my forehead, and enough bruises to give the impression that I had fought Mike Tyson for 10 rounds. Since I was stopped at the signal when he hit me, the other driver's insurance was contesting coverage and saying I was partially at fault. This was absurd. Here's what you should know about my father, though. I was never considered Donald Graves' daughter. He considered me to be a moneymaker. I had been making ends meet since my mother passed away when I was 14. Initially, it was minor details. Lunch money from my duties as a babysitter. By the age of 18, I was living at home and paying for my own college education. By the age of 25, I was covering 80% of the family expenses while he used his money for Barbara, his new bride, and whatever get-rich-quick plan he was interested in that month. The stench of disinfectant and hopelessness filled the hospital room. The nurse who saw him strike me had an urgent task to do at the opposite end of the ward. That's my father's problem. He had a manner of causing others to turn away. 6'3", with hands that had worked in construction for 30 years before his fortuitous back injury put him on disability, he was built like a linebacker gone to seed. It's funny that when he played golf every Tuesday, his back never hurt. Behind him, Barbara held her phony Louis Vuitton handbag, which she had purchased using the credit card she had opened in my name. I was unaware of that at the moment, but I would soon learn. She laughed nervously, like an anxious chihuahua, and she kept these tiny yips of approval whenever my father spoke out, "Are what I'm doing now." There was also my brother Jake, who was using his phone while leaning against the doorframe. Living in his childhood bedroom at the age of 26, he still lets his father cover all of his expenses and owes me $5,000 after his genius Bitcoin investment failed. He had committed to repaying me in installments each month. 14 months have passed since then. Tiffany, my father's 22-year-old new lover, was waiting in the hallway after my monthly auto payment is less than the cost of beauty school with extensions. Unaware of the family drama playing out, she continued to snap her gum and look at her reflection on her phone screen. Perhaps she simply didn't give a damn. I suppose you learn to disregard a lot when you're having sex with a man older than your own father. But here's the deal. My father was unaware of my side endeavor while he stood there yelling about the rent for the room I had been paying for since I was 18. He didn't realize that I had been working on something of my own late at night. The calculated risks, the meticulous planning. He believed me to be his pitiful daughter, struggling to make ends meet as a marketing coordinator at a mid-size company. I had already received 2 calls from my supervisor threatening to fire me if I missed any more work. He said, "Company policy," as if he were being helpful by alerting me. It seems that 3 days in the hospital went beyond their compassion limit. The first is when the rent is due, my dad said. And it was the third now. On the first I was unconscious, and on the second I was fighting for my life. And he wanted his money here on the third. Before she passed away, my mother had paid half of the $800 for a bedroom in the house. Despite my recollection of their combined ownership, the mansion somehow became exclusively his following her passing. When I said that I couldn't pay him while he was in the hospital, and that perhaps just possibly his daughter's health came first, then he lost it. It was more than his rental income. The tiny room echoed with the smack. My IV tore out as I slid sideways from the bed, causing blood to mix with the blood already in my mouth. The monitors went crazy, shrieking and blaring, but nobody showed up. Barbara laughed nervously. At last Jake glanced away from his phone, grinned, and resumed scrolling. Tiffany burst yet another bubble. When my father stated, "You've got 3 days," Mrs. Chen from next door decided to say, "Pay up or get out. Take a look around the room." Bless her, she had brought flowers. She recalled that my mother's favorite flowers were yellow roses. Her face became pale as she saw me on the ground, the blood, and my father's position. However, my father intervened when she attempted to assist me in getting up. "This is family business," he informed her. She gave me a look that told me she knew exactly what type of family company this was, but she quickly left the flowers on the side table. 3 days. I was given a bottle of pills and told to take it easy when I was released. Jake was kindly allowed to pick me up by my father, so I spent the whole 15-minute journey listening to him gripe about gas money. In fact, when he dropped me off, he extended his hand for $10. Only because I knew I would need the remaining $5 for the bus to physical therapy the following day did I give him $5. When I entered the house, everything seemed different. It was colder and quieter. While I was away, Tiffany had fully moved in. Her belongings are all over the place. Her flat iron on my bathroom counter, her protein shakes in my refrigerator section, and her yoga mat in the living room. In fact, she had placed a sign with a small heart over the eye that read Tiffany's Glam Room on the bathroom door. Barbara was seated among papers at the kitchen table. I discovered credit card applications later. When she saw me, she immediately covered them with a magazine, but not before I noticed my social security number on one of them. That's what she handed me. Chihuahua asked me how I was feeling while laughing. I wanted to say something like I'd been hit by a truck, and then my father, but I shrugged and went to my room instead. I discovered the padlock at that point. On my closet, not on my door. My computer, crucial documents, and all of my work attire are locked away. There was a sticky note on the lock that read, "See Donald for key rent first." I sat on my bed, which for some reason now had throw pillows with Tiffany's leopard print on them, and tried to think. Work. My phone had been buzzing constantly. Emails accumulating, clients inquiring about the status of their projects, and my boss growing more and more agitated. In order to work from home, I required a computer, but it was locked in the closet of the room I rented in a house my mother had partially owned. I left for physical therapy at 7 the following morning. The locks had been replaced by the time I returned at 9 o'clock. I just couldn't get my key to work. I stood there jiggling a useless key in a lock that no longer recognized me, still in pain, still hardly able to turn my head without flinching. Eventually, wearing one of my robes, the silk one my grandmother had given me for my college graduation, Tiffany opened the door. "Oh," she murmured while cracking that endless gum. She actually attempted to shut the door in my face, but I wedged my foot in, despite the fact that it caused excruciating pangs to shoot up my damaged side. "Donald, you don't live here anymore." I noticed them all in the living room at that point. Apparently there to inspect the accommodation for its rental were my father, Barbara, Jake, and my father's golf pal Randy. Potential. They were talking about how much they could charge a legitimate tenant who would value the chance. Randy was claiming $800 was too cheap. You could easily get salved $1,200 for a room that size with a private bathroom. I watched my family arrange for a replacement while I stood in the doorway, still dressed for physical therapy, and yet smelled like hospital and sadness. Jake was the first to notice me. He genuinely found it amusing that his sister was homeless and had fractured ribs and new stitches. Peak of humor. Barbara leaped to her feet and began her anxious routine. However, my father simply gave me this icy sense of contentment. "You had 3 days," he stated. "It's been 3 days." I attempted to clarify that my possessions were inside, that I required my paperwork, clothes, and work computer. After I paid the overdue rent and a security deposit for the new rental agreement he had drafted, which was $12,100 per month, he said I could have them. Because of rise evaluation, Mrs. Chen was now watering her garden while feigning to observe. She rushed over when my father went inside to retrieve the updated rental agreement. She put something in my hand, a key to her garden shed and $300 in cash. She said, "You can stay there tonight." She had to pretend, though, that she was only inquiring about my recuperation when my father returned. Then, in the middle of the day, he threatened her, warned her that he would notify the health department about her son's food truck if she got involved. Make-up infractions. The food truck owned by Mrs. Chen's son was the pinnacle of their American dream and her pride and joy. She returned to her garden after giving me a tearful look. With trembling hands, I signed the updated rental agreement. I needed my belongings, not because I planned to pay for them. My dad told me I could pick up my stuff and return tomorrow with the cash. He said, all of them, although Barbara was carrying my laptop bag over her shoulder and Jake was already sporting my college sweater. That evening, amid potting dirt, in Mrs. Chen's garden shed, I decided on fertilizer and fertilizer. But first, I had to know exactly what I was dealing with. I began contacting the bank, credit agencies, and old family acquaintances who could have information regarding my mother's passing that I was too young to comprehend at the time. I had a $5,000 balance on a credit card I had never created, according to the first credit card firm I called. 3,000 was the second. 7,000. The third said. Every one of them opened within the last 6 months. With my social security number, all while bills were concealed from me and sent to my father's home. Barbara was a beautiful, anxious, and laughing chihuahua who served me breakfast every morning and took $15,000 from my financial future. I was technically homeless a week later, but I didn't give up. Although my friend Shannon's apartment was about the size of my father's walk-in closet, she had allowed me to crash on her couch. We didn't spend much time together because she was a night nurse. Ships traveling at night, putting notes on the coffee machine for one another. Once, when everyone was out, I had gotten back into the house. Tiffany shared on Instagram that they were all heading to a casino for the day, along with a selfie of her and my dad playing slots. She had on my mother's pearl necklace, which was purportedly lost following the funeral. Since I was 16, the window to my old room had been loose, and I sneaked out to attend a school dance that my father had forbade me from going to. With a butter knife, I cracked it open and crawled in, my ribs screaming in protest. My room appeared to have been struck by a tornado. They had sorted everything out, taken what they needed, and left the rest lying around like garbage. They had left behind the old laptop I kept tucked away under the floorboard, the one with the cracked screen I had been using for my side project, but my work computer was gone. Little wonders. However, everything changed when I discovered something in my father's office. He had become careless. Perhaps he simply didn't think I would have the courage to look. Behind the same awful lighthouse painting he had owned for 20 years was the safe. My father was predictable despite his nastiness, so the combination was still my mother's birthday. I discovered the records of my mother's life insurance policy, my father's biggest deception. When she passed away at the age of 39 from an unexpected heart attack, $1.5 million was paid out. I was 14. Jake was 11 years old. According to the policy, the funds were to be kept in trust for her kids, available for living and educational costs when we turned 18. At 18, I had received nothing. At 18, Jake had received nothing. While my father had inexplicably managed to buy a new truck, a boat, annual trips to Vegas, and what appeared to be a hidden bank account in the Cayman Islands, we had both taken out college loans. It wasn't even the worst part, though. The letter my mother's doctor wrote a week before she passed away, alerting her to potentially harmful interactions between her heart, was the worst part: medication and a supplement that may result in arrhythmias that are deadly. The bottle of supplements was also in the safe, filled by a pharmacy 2 towns over and prescribed by a doctor I had never heard of. 2 days following the warning letter was the prescription date. As I photographed everything, my hands were trembling. The bank statements demonstrating frequent transfers to offshore accounts and the life insurance documentation. He continued to claim my mother as a dependent in the Medicare fraud. The tax returns in which he'd long after Jake and I had moved out and filed our own taxes, they still listed us as dependents. Then I heard the front door. They returned early. Tiffany was complaining that she had lost $50. My dad had a mood. Jake was talking to someone on the phone about taking out a loan while Barbara was laughing nervously. With the exception of a USB device marked Backup 2019, I restored everything. I cautiously shut the safe after slipping it into my pocket. Just as I heard footsteps on the wall, the painting returned. Stairs. I had to leave since the window wouldn't close correctly from the inside. I escaped through the back door as my father was entering his office, grabbing my old laptop and the few items of clothing they had left behind. A treasure trove was the USB drive. There has been tax evasion for 15 years. Bogus disability claims that included screenshots of emails discussing concealing assets from the IRS, video evidence of him exercising weights, playing golf, and assisting Randy in moving a piano, and most importantly, communications with a lawyer regarding how, if you possessed a power of attorney, you may access trust monies intended for children. I sat at Shannon's small kitchen table that evening while she was at work and began formulating a strategy. I had to call someone I hadn't spoken to in years, though. After the funeral, my father barred my mother's sister, Aunt Catherine, from our life. When she heard my voice, she began to cry and responded on the second ring. "I've been waiting for this call for 15 years, she stated. It had been 2 weeks. since my eviction, and I thought it was a good thing that the bruises were now turning green instead of purple. Shannon remarked that my impressionistic colour swirls made me resemble a living Monet painting. We established a pattern. She would leave me a sticky note with motivation and coffee. After dinner, I would give her a rundown of whatever drama I had discovered that day. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening before I go on to what transpired next. Your encouragement and remarks keep me going. Moving. Please subscribe if you haven't already. You have no idea how much it helps. Boxes of documents that Aunt Catherine had been storing in her attic were brought down by car from Boston. Photographs, correspondence, court documents, everything my father believed he had destroyed. We met at a diner 2 towns over, the kind that served coffee that could remove paint and had cracked vinyl booze. Her eyes were the same intense blue as my mother's, but she appeared older and greyer. She told me something that made me laugh while pushing a box across the table. Blood is chilled. My mother had been preparing to file for divorce from my father. She had recorded his gambling issue, engaged a lawyer, and discovered evidence of his first affair. 2 weeks prior to the initial court date, the heart attack occurred. My mother had retained a lawyer who was still in practice. With an office that smelled like old leather in justice, Richard Hoffman was a senior partner at Hoffman & Associates. He recalled the case, my mother, and how he was suspicious of her death but lacked evidence. He examined the USB, my proof, drive contents, the safe's pictures, and the records of credit theft. The words I had been waiting to hear were then spoken by him as he sat back in his chair. He can be buried. However, I required more. There was one important error on my father's part. In order to receive a multi-car discount, he had kept me on his auto insurance. This implied that I was legally in possession of the policy details, including the tracking information from the safe driver discount device he had set up. The gadget that displayed his daily commute to and from work. He had been receiving disability benefits for the past 5 years because he was unable to get out of bed. Barbara, on the other hand, was becoming more daring. Despite my destitution and injuries, she had opened 3 more cards in my name, as if she thought I wouldn't notice. Selling essential oils to other desperate housewives was her new side gig, and she was using them to finance it. In an attempt to profit off sales I would never make, she had even attempted to add me to her downline. Jake had put my grandmother's jewelry up for sale on the internet. Our family had owned the pearl necklace, the wedding ring set, and the Art Deco brooch for 4 generations. He was requesting fast cash sales. Obviously desperate. Not only had his cryptocurrency investment flopped, I found out that he had borrowed from those who crush fingers when you don't make your payments on time. My co-worker Melissa told me in private that my father had called the workplace and informed them that I was in drug addiction treatment, even though my employer had officially fired me via email, citing job desertion. That in order to fund my habit, I had stolen from the family. Even after hitting me, he emailed them a picture of me on the hospital floor, saying it was from a drug-related event. It was a tiring investigation. There were new revelations and betrayals every day. Using a fake signature, my father had reorganized the house that my mother had only partially paid for. Using the power of attorney he had given himself following her passing, he had cashed out her retirement assets. For $1, he had sold Randy her automobile. Then Randy had made $1 selling it back to him. They came up with a plan to evade taxes. However, Tiffany, the most unlikely source, made the greatest finding. One night, when she was crying and intoxicated, she called me. She had discovered that my father had another lover, who was only 18. She believed I would assist her in getting retribution. I bought her drinks, listened to her babble, then met her at a pub. Tiffany was actually more intelligent than she appeared to be. She had been keeping track of everything with the intention of using it for, eventually, blackmail. Videos showing my dad counting money from his construction labor done under the table. Screenshots of his dating profiles where he claimed to be a wealthy businessman without children. Pictures of him with his disability lawyer, and instruction on how to appear more injured. In exchange for 3 Cosmopolitans and the assurance that she would get to see him fall, she gave me everything. There is a whistleblower program at the IRS. You receive a percentage if you report tax fraud and it is collected. The paperwork I had back 15 years. My father owed about $400,000 in interest, fines, and unpaid taxes. The identity theft piqued the curiosity of the police. 6 credit cards totaling $15,000 was criminal territory. It wouldn't assist Barbara in court if she laughed nervously. The disability fraud was of interest to the Social Security Administration. Penalties, 5 years of unjustified payments, and possibly even jail time. But what would really kill me was learning about my mother's life insurance. Blow. If someone chose to look into her death more thoroughly, they might find evidence of insurance fraud, trust fund fraud, or even worse. Richard Hoffman began organizing documents, developing the case quietly at first. My dad had no idea what was going to happen. He was too preoccupied with converting my former room into an Airbnb and sharing pictures and descriptions of the quaint room in a family house on the internet. Family residence. It was almost comical how ironic it was. I would get updates via text from Mrs. Chen. "Your father bought a new truck," she would write. Barbara had hair extensions. Jake suffered a beating yesterday. Broken nose. Tiffany left home. A new girl moved in. They were using money they didn't have, living a life based on deception and stealing. However, the foundation was on the verge of collapse. I had been working on my side project in secret for 3 years, and it was almost ready to go live. An internet consulting company that focuses on assisting small businesses in recovering from fraud. I had learnt from the best thief I knew, which may seem ironic. I had enough contracts pre-sold to cover my annual living expenses, while my father believed me to be nothing more than his pitiful daughter, bleeding out on a hospital floor and pleading for forgiveness. I had organized clients, established the website and developed the processes. He didn't know what was about to happen. Not one of them did. The proof was assembled. The agencies were informed. The attorneys were prepared. The trap was in place. Now I just needed to spring it. For the first time in weeks, I was seated in a real office a month after the hospital smack. Not my previous, but poor The cubicle where my father had ruined my reputation. It felt like the White House to me, even though it was actually a shared workspace that I had rented for a day in order to meet my first official customer. Phoenix Financial Recovery, my company, had formally opened for business. Rising from the ashes of my father's devastation, I recognized the irony of the name. Mrs. Chen's nephew, whose restaurant partner had embezzled $40,000, was actually my first client. I would track down the money in 3 hours. He immediately paid my $5,000 charge through 6 shell corporations to a casino account. But as I was constructing my future, I was simultaneously methodically tearing up my father's history. Until they don't, the IRS operates slowly. When my father's bank account was frozen, it was the first indication that anything was amiss. I received 17 exclamation marks in a text message from Mrs. Chen. "At the Costco in Quadzilio, your father's card was just refused." The arrival of a certified letter at the residence served as the second indication. Jake put his signature on it, assuming he had placed an internet order for it. Mrs. Chen claimed that my father turned a color she had never seen on human flesh before, something between purple and grey, like a bruised storm cloud, when he opened it and saw the audit letter. The audit's initial scope was 5 years, but if they discovered fraud, they were free to go back farther, which they did since I had insured it. All of his documented cash jobs while on incapacity. He revealed every dollar he had concealed. Every tax form that contains a falsehood, highlighted in yellow, and accompanied with useful sticky notes outlining the differences. On a Tuesday, Barbara's predicament took a turn for the worst. While she was throwing her essential oils party, the police arrived. She was arrested for credit fraud and identity theft in front of 12 suburban mothers. Even when they read her rights, she continued to laugh nervously. The arresting officer, who had previously detained a man dressed as a clown, later told me that this was the most unsettling arrest he had ever made. The credit card. After that, businesses moved quickly. It turns out that people dislike fraud, particularly when it is so thoroughly documented. They demanded quick payback, froze all the cards, and began looking into if my father was aware of it. Of course he did. I was holding off on using the emails I had to prove it until phase 2. Jake's issue was resolved on its own in the most calmer appropriate manner. The day the IRS froze the accounts my father was unable to pay off, the people he owed money to arrived at the house. Additionally, Jake could no longer hide behind Daddy. All of his possessions, including the jewels he had taken from my grandmother, had to be sold. Here's the lovely part though. I had already spoken with the proprietor of the pawn store, laid out the circumstances, and made plans to get them back for half of what Jake received. The proprietor was a kind Korean man who detested thieves and recalled my mother. I reported the Airbnb ad for my health and safety, but my father attempted to salvage things by renting out my room. Violations. which were easy to locate because the window I had smashed to gain entry was still damaged. The bathroom had mold that had been painted over rather being cleaned, and the smoke detectors were broken. After I brought up the fact that my father had boasted about never obtaining permits for his do-it-yourself repairs, the city inspector became extremely meticulous. Tiffany's proof was invaluable. In her mother's house, she had captured my father instructing Ashley, his new girlfriend, on how to apply for credit cards. Before a doctor's appointment, she had a video showing him practicing his crippled walk, then forgetting and walking normally to his pickup. She has screenshots of him selling prescription drugs he obtained to treat his fictitious back problems. However, I discovered something by chance that turned out to be my favorite piece of evidence. Even though Jake had moved out at age 21 and was filing his own taxes, my father had been claiming him as a dependent for tax purposes for the previous 8 years. Both of them committed tax fraud, and Jake was completely unaware of it. When he learned, he quickly turned against my father, giving me whiplash. On a Wednesday, Richard Hoffman filed the lawsuit for the trust fund. In front of all of his friends, my father was served at his golf club. The complaint demanded that the $1.5 million life insurance policy be fully repaid, along with interest and damages. Additionally, he was legally charged with fraud, violation of fiduciary duty, and conversion of funds held in trust. Randy, his golf partner who had assisted him in avoiding taxes, was taken aback when the IRS arrived at his dealership for second-hand cars. It turns out that you join the conspiracy when you assist someone in committing tax fraud. When his wife found out that he had been concealing the money from their divorce procedures, she became especially irate. The disability investigation proceeded more quickly than anticipated. They had video evidence from Tiffany's recordings, the Safe Driver app, and social media posts where my father failed to remember that he was meant to be bedridden. They determined that he owed them $230,000 in penalties and bogus payments. I had a successful internet business. The small company sector immediately learned about the woman who could uncover fraud and locate hidden funds. For 3 months I had a full schedule, had to raise my prices twice, and still had to turn away customers. The nicest part was that I was, of course, anonymously recording everything on a blog. My most shared post, How to Survive Family Financial Fraud, has received thousands of shares. I recently signed a lease for a gorgeous new apartment, and the ad revenue alone covered my rent. Mrs. Chen could come for tea in this 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony without worrying about my father's threats. My father was frantically trying to keep the house of cards from collapsing. He attempted to call me, and left voicemails that were a mix of pleading, crying, and threats. I kept all of the proof in case I ever needed a restraining order. All of his assets were frozen when he attempted to sell them. His credit was ruined when he attempted to borrow money. His new girlfriend attempted to assist him, but she had Googled him and came across my blog. While he was meeting with a bankruptcy attorney, she texted him. Not only was the trap tightening, but it was slamming shut with the weight of 15 years of unfulfilled karma. The universe made the decision to collect its debt all at once 6 weeks after that hospital smack. It began about 9:00 a.m. on a Monday, when a seizure notification from the IRS arrived. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row and used FaceTime to walk me through each play. Initially, they grabbed my father's brand new truck, which he had purchased with my money from the mother's trust fund. In fact, he attempted to argue that it was a medical need for his fictitious disability, but the agent merely chuckled and gestured to the racing stripes and elevated suspension. I'm fairly certain that those aren't typical medical adjustments. Everything in the house was marked for auction. The home theater system, the jet skis, the yacht, and even Barbara's collection of essential oils. There was no sign of her. Because their accounts were stopped, she was unable to post bail and was incarcerated in the county jail. Her attorney had already made contact with me regarding a plea agreement. I promised to give it some thought. However, we both understood that I would not give up. My mother's death was being investigated as a result of the trust fund case. The authorities launched a cold case review after noticing the life insurance documents and the strange timing, even though I hadn't pressed for it. Tiffany had already provided the police with the safe combination when my father became frightened and attempted to delete the evidence. They discovered everything, including documents I was unaware existed. Jake lost it. Similar to an egg. He consented to testify against our father after being charged with tax fraud. He acknowledged being aware of the trust fund, aiding in the concealment of assets, and the fraudulent disability claims. He even told me something I was unaware of. My father had a second family in Florida, where he claimed to have 2 children and had been giving money to a woman for 10 years. The FBI was called in for interstate fraud in the Florida revelation. Federal charges replaced state charges against my father. The prosecutor made a call. It was one of the largest family fraud cases she had ever witnessed, in my opinion. However, after the tale got viral, the real circus began. Following the highly publicized arrest at the golf club, a local reporter had been following the story. She had interviewed Mrs. Mi Chen, a few of my old co-workers who were aware of the truth, and even Tiffany, who arrived at the interview looking glamorous while sporting my mother's pearl necklace, which I had repurchased and gave to her as a token of appreciation. Local man was the headline. My father attempted to control the situation by going on local radio and claiming that I was a disgruntled daughter, making things up for attention. However, the host had done his homework and played audio of my father from his disability hearing, claiming he couldn't walk, then playing video from that same day of him carrying a refrigerator. The IRS auction was set for a Saturday, and I arrived with cash, ready to buy back anything of my mother's they were selling. The interview ended with my father yelling obscenities and threatening to sue everyone. The station had to bleep so much of it that it sounded like Morse code, and someone even made a remix that received 1 million views on TikTok. This is where the story gets really good. After learning that he had lost his own mother at a young age, he made sure that every sentimental item, such as my mother's china set, $1, her wedding album, $1, and the rocking chair she had nursed us in, $1, went to me for the minimum bid. Other bidders began to realize this and backed off, allowing me to reclaim my heritage $1 at a time. An older woman in the back sobbed and gave me a hug afterward, telling me that my mother would be proud. My father watched from his car, unable to. The criminal trial was scheduled for 3 months from now, but the financial destruction was immediate. The IRS wanted $600,000, including penalties. Social Security wanted $230,000. The trust fund lawsuit judgment came back at $2.1 million with interest. His total debt was over $3 million. He had to watch his entire life being sold off, his house being emptied, his world collapsing, and he was powerless to stop it because of the restraining order I had obtained after he had shown up drunk at Shannon's apartment. Declared bankruptcy, but you can't discharge fraud judgments. If he weren't incarcerated, he would have to pay this back for the rest of his life. The prosecutor was pushing for 15 years. Barbara accepted a plea deal that included 18 months and full restitution. She gave up everything, including recordings of my father planning the fraud. It turned out that she had also been recording him, insurance for when he inevitably turned on her. Jake received probation and community service. The second family in Florida sued my father for fraud and emotional distress after he was told he was a widower with no children and that he was wealthy from his construction business. She had been living off his payments without realizing it was him. The judge garnished his wages for the next 10 years, and he got a job at the car wash that my father used to make fun of, the one where he'd said, "Only losers work." He had to wear the uniform with the little hat and everything. The sweetest moment came when my business hit its first million in revenue, 6 weeks from homeless to millionaire, and I took Mrs. Chen to the nicest restaurant in town, the one my father had always claimed was too expensive for us, but where he'd taken his girlfriends, where we sat at the best table, ordered champagne, and toasted. 2 months after that hospital slap, my father stood in a courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with his complexion. He was 10 years and 8 weeks old, and the federal charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy had stuck. The waiter recognized me from the news and complimented our dessert. The chef came out to shake my hand. The entire restaurant knew my story, and they were all Team Kwana. When the state discovered that he had been stealing from my grandmother before she passed away, she had dementia, and he had persuaded her to sign over her Social Security checks. They added elder abuse charges. His attorney attempted to portray him as a grieving widower who had made mistakes, but the prosecutor had actual receipts from trips to Vegas, his boat purchase the day after my mother's funeral, and the breast augmentation he had purchased for his third girlfriend while I was taking out student loans. The judge was unforgiving. She had seen the security footage of him slapping me at the hospital, read the emails in which he laughed about leaving me homeless, and examined the trust fund documents that demonstrated he had stolen from his own children during our difficult time. The sentence was 15 years in federal prison, with no chance of early release for 5. He would be 72 when he was released, and if he lived that long, he would miss everything. Any grandchildren I might have any chance to turn his life around, any chance to live a normal life. However, the judge permitted victim impact statements before they took him away, and I spent weeks preparing mine in front of the mirror until I could say it without crying. I told the court about my motherless upbringing, my 3 jobs in college while he spent my trust fund on gambling, the nights I went without food to pay the rent he demanded, the hospital, the slap, and the blood in my... I looked him in the eye and said, You tried to bury me, not knowing I was a seed, but I also told them about my success, my company, which now employs 12 people, the foundation I was starting for young women who had been financially abused by family members, and the book deal I recently signed to share this story with the world. Now watch me develop. The judge permitted the crowd to erupt in applause for precisely 3 seconds. Before calling for order, my father attempted to reply, but his own attorney put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head, leaving him speechless. Barbara was already serving her sentence, teaching yoga to other prisoners, and writing me letters in which she apologized and begged for forgiveness. I returned them unopened. Some bridges are meant to remain burned. Jake's journey was different. The garnishment of his wages had made him work for the first time in his life, and the humiliation of the car wash had humbled him. He had written me a letter, a genuine one, without asking for anything, admitting that he had been jealous of me all our lives, that Dad had set us against each other, that he had chosen the easy path of being the golden child while I had fought for everything, and that he was sorry about Mum, about the jewellery, and about not standing up for me at the hospital. I wrote back once, telling him forgiveness was earned, not demanded. He was attending Gamblers, anonymous, getting a second job, and was gradually repaying his debts, provided, but that I was keeping an eye on his development. Perhaps we will be siblings again in the future. Perhaps the house was foreclosed upon. My father had used it as leverage, and without his illicit income, the payments were not able to be made. It went up for auction, and you won't believe who bought it, Mrs. Chen's son, the one with the food truck. My father had threatened to take it for half its value, and he converted it into a community centre for elderly Asian immigrants, a place for them to foldly. He placed a plaque by the front door in memory of Linda Graves that read, "A mother taken too soon." My mother would have loved that. She had always been kind to Mrs. Chen and had always helped with translations and rides to appointments. The investigation into my mother's death was still open but unresolved. The supplement that may have caused her heart attack had been legally prescribed, even though it was suspiciously timed. Without hard evidence of intent, I used some of the money from the recovered trust fund to hire a forensic accountant to find everything else he'd hidden, and we found accounts. They couldn't charge him with murder, but everyone in the town knew what he'd probably done. His reputation was ruined beyond repair. His golf club revoked his membership. His favourite bar banned him for life, and even the grocery store employees mysteriously ran out of whatever he tried to buy. He was a pariah before he even reached prison. I chose a gorgeous Victorian 3 blocks from Mrs. Chen with a garden where I could grow the yellow roses my mother had loved, and on my first night in my own home, I sat on the porch swing and sobbed good tears of relief, freedom and victory, because my business had grown beyond my dreams and we'd helped. In the Bahamas, cryptocurrency wallets, even gold coins buried in the backyard like some paranoid pirate. Every penny was seized and put toward his debts. I hired Shannon as my operations manager, paid her enough to allow her to quit nursing and work regular hours, recovered over $50 million in the first year, taking a percentage that made me richer than I could have ever dreamed, hired other women who had been financially abused, trained them, gave them careers and gave them hope. 6 months after that hospital slap, I stood at my mother's grave with news she would have loved. I brought yellow roses that seemed to glow in the morning sun, and for the first time in the foundation I had founded, the Linda Graves Fund for Financial Freedom, had just awarded its first grants to 10 women, all under 30, who were fleeing financial abuse from family members. We provided emergency housing, legal assistance, and financial counseling, and one recipient had already launched her own business with the money. Dad received 15 years, I told the headstone. Barbara is in jail. Jake is actually working. And I'm okay, Mum. I'm thriving. My father had been in prison for 2 months when I received the call. He had been beaten by other prisoners after they discovered that he had stolen from his deceased wife's children. He was in the infirmary and would recover, but would require protective custody for the remainder of his sentence. He was alone, isolated, and terrified every day. I felt nothing, which was its own form of freedom. Our Help, a bakery that donated day-old bread to shelters. He had already paid back half of his debt, working 80 weeks between the car wash and a night janitor job. He had even begun dating a nice girl from his GA meetings, someone who understood growth and struggle. He had sent me a picture of them at a free concert in the park, both of them grinning sincerely. I had smiled back to myself in my office and saved the picture. Barbara had, of course, found religion in prison. She had become the chaplain's assistant, leading prayer groups with the same anxious energy she'd once brought to essential oil parties. Her letters had stopped after I had my lawyer send a cease and desist. The silence was golden. The media attention had finally subsided, though I was still occasionally recognized, usually by women who would pull me aside in grocery stores or coffee shops to whisper their own stories of financial abuse in their families. I'd give them my card, tell them they weren't alone, and tell them there was hope beyond the pain. My business had grown to 3 cities. My father had likely watched that interview from his cell, but I didn't feel satisfied by the idea. The best retaliation was living well, and I was living exceptionally. Mrs. Chen had become my unofficial grandmother, joining me for Sunday dinners and teaching me how to make her famous dumplings, by the end of the year with plans for national coverage. We had been featured in Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, and even 60 Minutes, where Anderson Cooper had called my story a testament to resilience. The irony of teaching economic empowerment in the place where I had been economically enslaved was not lost on me. I occasionally stopped by to teach financial literacy classes in the room that had been mine. The surprise came when Ashley, my father's last girlfriend, who was 18 years old, pregnant and traumatized, reached out. My father had persuaded her to drop out of high school, cut her off from her family, and abandoned her when his world fell apart, collapsed. She had nowhere to go, and I could have turned her away. No one would have blamed me, but I recognized myself in her eyes. She was another girl my father had attempted to ruin, and I helped her get a GED, connect her with the foundation, and get her into transitional housing. When her daughter was born, she named her Linda after my mother, and I cried when she told me the kind of tears that mend old wounds. The final twist in the story was when the IRS whistleblower payment arrived, 30% of what they collected from on a random Tuesday, my father's tax fraud, just over $200,000, was deposited straight into my account. I spent an hour staring at the balance, figuring out how many women the foundation could assist with that money, but first I took care of myself. I took a first-class flight to Paris and spent 2 weeks there. I had always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, eat real croissants, and stroll along the sand. My mother had promised to take me for my 16th birthday, a promise my father had broken everything else. Sent him a postcard from the top of the tower, saying, "Wish you were here." It was simple, just kidding. Q. Aunt Catherine had received a letter when I got back, saying that she wanted to see me after receiving a stage 3 cancer diagnosis. I drove to Boston that night, held her hand through chemotherapy, and moved into her guest room to assist with her care. She had supported me when I needed the truth, and now I would be there for her through whatever came next. She recovered against all odds. The last cosmic justice arrived in month 6, when my father was assigned to work as a financial clerk in the library, helping other prisoners with their taxes, earning 14 cents an hour, which was garnished for restitution. At that rate he would need to live to be 400 to pay everything. We celebrated with champagne and plans for her to move closer to me. She would sell her Boston house, buy something near mine and Mrs. Chen's, and we would form our own little family, chosen and cherished, bound by love rather than blood. Professional admiration from one fraud hunter to another. His new girlfriend, an IRS auditor, had been looking into him separately and had played him like a fiddle, gathering evidence while feigning to fall for his charms. She sent me a thank you card with a Starbucks gift card inside, writing, "Just wanted you to know he never had a chance." 6 months after everything began, I stood in my garden and watched the sunset over my yellow roses while my phone buzzed with messages from... My book was already in its 3rd edition. The foundation had recently received approval for a significant grant. Clients, staff and friends who had become family.